Good morning, everybody. Very warm welcome to this session with our very own Center Fellow, Angie Chau. Before I start off and before I introduce Angie today, let me remind you and acknowledge with respect that we do meet on the Lekwungen people's territory, and that this traditional territory of the Lekwungen people continues to today. And let me acknowledge in particular the songs describing the Sanish peoples who has lived and played and occupied this land for centuries. Angie Chau is a CFGS faculty fellow and an assistant professor in modern Chinese literature and film in the Department of Pacific and Asia Studies. She joined UVic in 2018 and since then has pursued her research, and we will hear more about this. The current project, I think, will be at the center of Angie's presentation. It is entitled Paris and the Art of Transposition, and it looks at the kind of a transnational investigation of Chinese writers and artists in Paris during the first half of the 20th century. Before we started to joke a little bit, and I thought Paris must have been full with artists, from all over the world in the first part of the 20th century. Really, a kind of a most fascinating point of encounter of different cultures and artists coming to the French capital. Angie, to give you a bit of background, since we don't meet so often in person, Angie obtained her MA in Interdisciplinary Studies from New York University in 2004 and a PhD in Literature from the University of California, San Diego in 2012. And then she taught at different universities, also in China and Shanghai, at Arizona State University, and at the University of California in San Diego. So Angie's expertise and knowledge extends, all across different forms of artistic expression, literature, visual culture, pop culture, and translation. And it's a real pleasure to hearing about your research, Angie. The floor is all yours. I think we're going to switch PowerPoints, but very warm welcome again from the center, and please take it away and enlighten us on Chinese artists in Paris in the first part of the 20th century.
Okay, thank you, Oliver, for the kind introduction, and also for the center for having me this semester. And for everybody else, thank you for joining in today. I'm going to share my screen. And please let me know if you have any trouble seeing this. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah,
okay.
Both visual and audio
Great.
is perfect.
Perfect, okay. So today I'll be giving my talk in roughly 3 parts. This is part of the book project that I've been working on. So I am preparing my book proposal, and I'll be reading part of the introduction from that. And then I'll be jumping into some of the examples that I talk about in my project. And then I'll finish with just some kind of comments in conclusion. So the introduction to my project is titled Beyond Shanghai, the Modern Chinese Artists in Paris. And I'll just jump right in. In November 2009, the Centre Pompidou opened the Centre Pompidou West Bund Museum Project, a joint collaboration with the state-owned West Bund Group on the Huangpu River in Shanghai. This is located in a formerly industrial neighborhood, which was transformed in the last decade into a kind of museum mile. A global endeavor, the 5-year contract project features architecture designed by British architect David Chipperfield, and it was hyped as the largest ever cultural exchange between France and China. Exchange in this case refers to the Georges Pompidou Center, which is the world-renowned Parisian Museum of Contemporary Art. And so they are responsible for lending artwork from its collection to the new China Outpost. And then they also provide consulting on educational programming and museum training to the West Bund. And in turn, the West Bund Group pays for real estate space and gives the Pompidou 2.75 million euros a year, plus transportation and insurance fees. This is all under the agreement that after 5 years, both sides evaluate how things are going, and then they decide whether to continue with the collaboration or not. So the project has faced steady criticism, beginning from its planning stages, which took place almost 2 decades ago, and then ongoing censorship concerns. So back in 2006, as the Louvre was getting ready to open an outpost in Abu Dhabi, and the Pompidou considered a Shanghai location, members of the French art elite published a panicky op-ed in Le Monde claiming that the nation's museums were not for sale. They wrote, "It's reasonable to dream of a world where people and consumer goods circulate freely, but heritage objects are not consumer goods. And preserving their future means guaranteeing their universal value for tomorrow." Likening the exchange of capital for culture to selling one's soul, the authors pleaded, "What more can we offer in France than our art treasures, which attract nearly 76 million tourists every year, the most in the world?" Recent attempts at cultural exchange and practice of art diplomacy in the 21st century context reveal an underlying sense of desperation on both sides. France, on the one hand, has tried to maintain a grip on its diminishing cultural relevance, as seen on the December 3rd, 2007 cover of Time magazine, the European edition, which proclaimed the death of French culture and challenged its readers. Quick, name a living artist or writer from France who has global significance. Donald Morrison's cover story, later expanded to book form, suggested that France could reclaim its cultural throne by expanding cultural and language promotion effort overseas, and by supporting domestic cultural diversity. On the other hand, China has pursued an equally challenging project, trying to combat global views of its oppressive authoritarian regime, especially in light of negative PR from recent media coverage of the Uyghur internment in Xinjiang and the Hong Kong protests. So give you a sense of some just recent headlines from this year, all supporting this kind of global warning. So we see artificial intelligence, totalitarian control, and then most recently with the pandemic and China's handling of that. Collaboration with overseas cultural institutions acts as a form of soft power, potentially allowing overseas audiences and domestic consumers alike to view China as a progressive, more culturally open and connected nation. China and France's respective positions in the world economy have shifted dramatically since the early 20th century, yet the art world continues to be a site of contested exchange, shifting with the uneven rhythms of political and cultural tensions between China and the West. In the fields of contemporary Chinese art and literature, ethnic Chinese writers like Gao Xingjian and Dai Sijie write and publish in Chinese and French, but because their work has been banned in China, they reside in France and are considered somewhat contentiously Francophone writers. In 2000, Gao Xingjian, a French citizen born in China, was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, causing the Chinese government to accuse the committee of choosing a French writer for political purposes. The world recognition achieved by these writers seems closely linked to the enduring legacy of Paris as the site of unfettered creative expression and universal value, as suggested by Pascale Casanova, who argues persuasively in the World Republic of Letters that Paris has long served as the site of literary consecration, by which writers attain literary prestige by publishing in France, writing in French, or having their work translated into French. But a closer look at some failed experiments in Chinese literary and art historiography suggests that the myth of Paris may not be as universal as commonly assumed. Long before Chinese funding was viewed as a controversial form of life support for cultural institutions, the figure of the modern Chinese artist circulated in China and France, signaling the perceived promise of Sino-French cultural exchange. In the 1920s, many young Chinese traveled abroad to Japan or Europe to study in the aftermath of the May 4th movement, the cultural and political push to modernize China after World War I. From 1919 to 1921, the work-study movement alone sent more than 1,600 Chinese students to France to work in factories in exchange for a Western college education. Historically, France has been recognized as a key stepping stone in the formation of future Chinese Communist Party leaders, including Zhou Enlai, the first premier of the People's Republic of China, and Deng Xiaoping. During the same time period, Paris was seen as the most desirable destination for foreign aspiring writers and artists, not only from China, but also from other parts of Asia and Europe. The International Coterie, belonging to the informal school of Paris, became associated with the neighborhood of Montparnasse, which was established during the interwar period as an artistic community for non-French artists working in Paris, including artists such as Picasso, Chagall, and Modigliani, who all migrated to France in the first decade of the 20th century. While considerable anti-Semitic and anti-immigrant sentiment was directed towards some of these artists, the foreign community helped foster national pride, affirming the cultural prestige of Paris. The art critic André Werneau coined the School of Paris in 1925, declaring, "It's undeniable our museums are famous, but even more than our artistic riches, these artists want to know the country where our great painters lived, breathe the air they breathed, be moved by our perspectives, to finally know the joy of living and to enjoy this liberty without which art cannot blossom." Werneau's vision of faithful foreign artists on pilgrimage in Paris certainly aligns with Casanova's depiction of an idealized city where artistic freedom could be proclaimed and lived. But not all of its visitors were able to translate their so-called creative freedom into artistic influence and critical success. In Guo Jianning's 1930s cartoon introduction, a Chinese man in a Western-style suit stands stunned as a male artist holding a painter's palette presents him with a nude female model. Miss Chen, the model, dangles a cigarette holder in her hand, and she stands on a pile of drapery, perhaps her clothes that she's taken off. The caption reads, "Old Huang, please allow me to present to you Miss Chen," implying that the visitor Huang's shocked expression is the result of being confronted with the model's full frontal nudity. The cartoon's humor relies on the ironic contrast between formality, as indicated by the physical appearance of Huang, and the artist's speech in respectfully presenting the model as Miss Chen, and then the shock produced by the viewing of this naked female body. The greeting "Old Huang" indicates that the two male figures are familiar with one another, and this level of familiarity only emphasizes the awkwardness of the encounter. The three figures depicted in the cartoon represent being modern in their own ways, but my project focuses on the artist in particular. With his short-sleeved collared shirt and belted pants, dress shoes, and cravat, he serves as a mediator between the controversial practice of using nude models for life drawing. This was promoted as Western scientific method in art pedagogy, and Huang, who appears modern in dress, but has yet to change his conservative Chinese mindset. The question of what the artist is painting is not really important here, as the canvas surface is mostly obstructed by the artist, and the center of the cartoon is squarely focused on the model's nude backside. The dilemma then is not really with aesthetic style or content of the artist's work, but rather the uncomfortable position in which the everyday modern Chinese citizen may find himself when presented with a nude female body under the pretext of scientific accuracy or artistic enlightenment. Guo's illustration imagines the art studio as a transformative site of encounter and negotiation. How much power the nude female model has in this interaction is debatable, but the male artist is clearly the one determining the message being conveyed, and he provides the physical space for provocation. The trope of the bohemian Chinese artist with his nude model as a source of anxiety and allure is a recurring image especially prominent in creative work from the 1920s to 1940s by Chinese artists and writers in connection with travel to France during this period. Scholarly studies of Republican-era cultural production have conventionally focused on Shanghai, where a thriving publishing industry and growing consumer culture contributed to a hybridized and transcultural semi-colonial urban space. Shifting the discussion of aesthetic modernism from Shanghai to the setting of Paris, my study highlights the impact of cross-cultural encounters on artistic production by asking, what was the role of modern art in promoting intercultural understanding among Chinese intellectuals in the West in the early 20th century? More specifically, what kinds of expectations did Chinese writers and artists face in Paris, the city described as, quote, the capital of the literary world, the city endowed with the greatest prestige on earth? This is from Pascal Casanova again. And what images of the modern Chinese artists circulated in China and France as a result of these encounters? This project treats Paris as a site of negotiation where Chinese artists and writers were motivated to emphasize recognizable aspects of Chinese culture and identity, what's commonly referred to as Chineseness. And this is a concept nearly impossible to define as it refers to a matrix of constantly changing ideas, meaning different things to different people in different moments. In the late 1910s, leading intellectuals like Chen and Hu Shi called for sweeping reforms in Chinese language, literature, and art as part of the New Culture Movement's National Salvation Project. This was in the face of encroaching Western and Japanese imperialism. Writers and artists were faced with a daunting prospect of creating modern art forms markedly distinct from those of their predecessors. Studying in Paris, the birthplace of Western modernism, was an obvious educational path for those who could afford to travel abroad. Ling Fu, a pioneer of modern Chinese art, who studied in Paris and eventually founded the Hangzhou National College of Art upon his return in China, published an essay in 1926 on the promise of Oriental and Western culture in the Shanghai journal Oriental Miscellany. Ling stressed the importance for Chinese artists to learn from Western artists in order to achieve a Chinese art renaissance. And he recommended two key objectives for modern artists. We should import basic Western art methods by introducing historical concepts and specific ways of implementation, and also reorganize traditional Chinese art in order to contribute to the world. So one example of an intercultural effort to promote Chinese art on a global level took place in 1933, when the painter Xu Beihong helped to organize an exhibit of nearly 200 Chinese works of art at the Musée du Jeu de Paume in Paris. The exhibition catalog featured a piece by Académie Française cultural celebrity Paul Valéry, who commended the noble and very brave young Chinese painters like Xu Beihong. Valéry likened the wave of Chinese art students studying in Paris at the time, who were finally exposed to European artwork, to an artist from the Middle Ages who suddenly becomes enlightened through the discovery of ancient Greek art. He wrote, but the gap here is infinitely greater. Physiology intervenes, even vision is at stake. Two ways of seeing wonderfully different are presented to the artist. What will he do? What lesson will he take from our museums? What work will he be able to carry out with our brushes and our oil colors? What interpretation will he give to the Titian he copies? But the majority of contemporary works showcased in the exhibit were those inspired by traditional Chinese ink paintings by artists like Zhang Daqian and Qi Baishi. Valéry urged his compatriots to elevate the prestige of Chinese art beyond the conventional Western European view of it as mere curiosities, bizarre inventions, monstrosities, to the level that had previously only been accorded to classical Chinese poetry. This exhibit was a success. It attracted 30,000 visitors over 2 extended runs, the exhibition catalog was reprinted twice. It sold out each time. We can see Valerie's depiction of the hypothetical modern Chinese artist as being limited to a paternalistic imagining of a nation in crisis mode, perhaps a projection of his own anxiety over the perceived decline of France in the interwar period. Similar to Ling Fu's proposed recipe for a rebirth of Chinese art through Western learning, Valerie hoped that Chinese art learning in Paris could be a mutually beneficial exchange used to rejuvenate Western art. But the language used by both in their speculations about the potential outcome of new ways of seeing and the creative possibilities that French art provided to Chinese artists are at odds with the futuristic visions they describe, which are still very limited to perpetuating or even preserving existing forms of national art. So next I'll be talking a little bit about language. The issue of language, which is usually framed in terms of the process of translation, is widely accepted as a crucial piece to the puzzle of intercultural encounter and exchange. Emily Apter's The Translation Zone identifies the field of translation as bookended by opposite theoretical poles, best expressed through two generalizations. Nothing is translatable and everything is translatable. The question of how to determine whether translation is good or not, if this is even a task that can be accomplished, continues to entice and frustrate scholars, writers, and critics. And it's resulted in the creation of new terms. So one example, in her book on national culture and translated modernity in China from 1900 to 1937, Lydia Liu defines translingual practice as the process by which new words, meanings, discourses, and modes of representation arise, circulate, and acquire legitimacy within the host language due to or in spite of the latter's contact or collision with the guest language. While Liu's recognition of translation as a site of struggle, by no means a neutral event, is important, I propose that thinking about the historical period through the alternative lens of transposition helps to move away from the linguistic guest-host model of translation, and it can offer a much needed way to account for creative adaptations that defy conventional national linguistic and media boundaries. Transposition can help us understand, for example, why a poet like Lee Jin Fat would use Chinese language in his experimental poems, which are not quite bilingual, nor do they fit neatly under the labels of Francophone or Sinophone writing. So transposition is the concept that's used frequently in music and genetics, and it refers to transposing music from one key or clef to another, or it can also refer to transposing a song originally composed for one instrument to another. As such, this deliberate misreading, this is a phrase that David Kelly uses, it relies on two seemingly conflicting goals: recognition of an original source of inspiration, and also celebration of creative difference in a distinct way. In other words, while translation relies on verisimilitude and emphasizing tropes of equivalence, transposition highlights the transposed work's departure from its previous iteration, as it appears in a fresh context. French literary studies have used the concept of transposition to discuss the relationship between visual art, music, and literature, primarily in the work of 19th century poets and art critics like Théophile Gautier and Baudelaire. As Baudelaire famously claimed in his Salon of 1846, the best account of a picture may well be a sonnet or an elegy. The role of the shift in context is especially noteworthy when taking into account the relative difficulty with which images circulated in the 19th and early 20th centuries, compared to the present day, when readers have quicker and easier access to the same materials as the writer. Rosemary Lloyd points out in Baudelaire's world that critics face the challenge of summoning into the reader's imagination the colors and tones and shapes of a work they may never have seen. Chinese travelers faced this same problem when they were abroad, in that many of their compatriots would not be able to visit museums in Paris or view even reproductions of the art masterpieces in question. Just as most French readers could not read classical Chinese poetry or necessarily know what Chinese calligraphy looked like. But this challenge could also present some unique advantages in freeing up limitations shaped by long-held beliefs about style or language, potentially opening up the horizon of reader expectations. Literary theorist Gérard Genette has defined transposition very broadly as any kind of serious transformation. He argues that the term is, quote, the most important of all hypertextual practices because of its potential to create new works whose textual amplitude and aesthetic and/or ideological ambition may mask or even completely obfuscate their hypertextual character. I disagree with Genette's designation of transposition as a neutral and extensive term, and theorize transposition instead as a fluid and strategic artistic process that depends on the tension between foreign and familiar, new and old, one that celebrates simultaneously both novelty and recognition when a text gets placed into a fresh context. While the process can be related to linguistic translation, it extends beyond the limitations of language to acknowledge a wider repertoire of creative possibilities, ranging from the act of placing familiar material in an unfamiliar setting to making something strange more approachable. A work that encompasses most of these traits is this volume, the Poem the Talcion, the collection of Chinese poet Liang Zongdai's translations of classical poetry, written by Talcion and published in 1929 by Éditions Le Marger in Paris. Dedicating the volume to his French contemporary, the writer Jean Prévost, Liang Zongdai recounted having the long completed translations dormant in his desk, not daring to share them with his colleagues until one night, alongside the night glow of the sun, Prévost enthusiastically approved his translations. Liang credited Prévost with giving him the initial support and encouragement for the translation project, concluding, "These poems, which we read together gradually as they were transposed into French, have since undergone many minor changes, but I am sure that you will recognize them." Liang Zongdai's use of the verb transpose describes the collaborative, mysteriously inexact process of reading and translating Talcion's poetry from the classical literary Chinese to French, the latter a language relatively new to Liang Zongdai. For him, revisions may be numerous and desirable, but ultimately the French reader must still recognize the translations as renditions of classical Chinese poetry. So my project's focus on transposition was inspired by Liang Zongdai's choice of words in its dedication, which I first encountered while I was researching the work of the painter Chau, whose visual art is the subject of one of my chapters. By the early 1920s, Baudelaire's poetry and prose appeared in China, translated by leading literary figures such as Zhou Zhuoren and Xu Zhimo. Liang Zongdai himself subsequently published 4 translations of Baudelaire in 1934, including Correspondance from Les Fleurs du Mal, and he was likely familiar with the creative implications of transposition versus linguistic translation, as he wrote his dedication to Prévost. I was initially drawn to this collection of poetry because of Chau's series of 3 copper plate engravings commissioned for the project. I'll show you this in a later slide, as illustrations to accompany 3 of the most famous poems. And I gradually came to realize the volume's significance as an example of this kind of collaborative intercultural dialogue between Chinese and French cultural luminaries. In the book's preface, Paul Valéry attributes Liang's literary skill to his Chinese identity. He writes, although Chinese, but no, because he was Chinese, Liang was necessarily better able than the average European, better than the average Frenchman even, to transform language, extracting the most important bits to create a rare stone out of one word. Liang Zongdai's translations then, along with Changyu's visual renderings serve as affirmation of Valerie's claim that the Chinese race is or was the most literary of races, by paying homage to one of the most venerated literary figures in classical Chinese poetry. So viewing these works as transpositions provides insight to the kinds of artistic agency that Liang Zongdai and Changyu had in France as Chinese intellectuals. In these uneven relationships with their French mentors, Liang Zongdai and Changyu, by being perceived as inheritors of Talcion's legacy, can reclaim some level of discursive control over French perceptions of Chinese identity through literature and art. And this is a tangible way through which they can insert themselves and their work, along with Chinese art and literature at large, into a global art movement and literary history. I'll skip ahead a little bit. And so, according to Valerie, the accessibility of Talcion's poetry is what makes it a classic. And this very quality of not requiring any specialized or linguistic expertise to comprehend also reinforces the ambivalent attitude of practitioners of transposition toward reconciling the unfamiliar with the familiar. So together, Liang Zongdai, Paul-Valéry Prévost, and Changyu participated in making classical Chinese poetry accessible to French readers. But how effective was this project? In the subsequent chapters of my project, I talk about some of the ways in which Chinese writers and artists experimented with cultural notions of new and old, foreign and domestic, Chinese and French identities. And I try to offer reflections on how some of the resistance they encountered can be traced to these transpositions or deliberate misreadings of Chinese and French art and literature. So compared to translation, which Casanova states is a process of establishing value, transposition is therefore precarious with no guaranteed results. If we think about this process of littérisation, which refers to the transformation that a text undergoes to be recognized as proper literature or to acquire literariness, we can think of transposition instead as a much riskier undertaking that defies aesthetic constraints and conventions. So I'll stop reading for a little bit and just show you some of the specific examples that I focus on. And this is just an excerpt from the beginning of one of Lee Jin Fat's poems that I analyze. This poet, Lee Jin Fat, arrived in France in 1919, and he had no training as a poet. He went to France actually to study sculpture. And there's this very interesting kind of origin story associated with him that he wrote about in his memoir, which is that one day in France when he was studying abroad, he suddenly fell ill and he was on his deathbed. He was delirious and he had this fever that lasted for days. And amidst his delirium, this golden-haired goddess dressed in white came to him and visited in his dreams numerous times and took him on these hallucinatory journeys through the heavens. And miraculously, he survived this illness. And then this was kind of his muse of inspiration for writing poetry. So I'm interested in this idea of the muse as, for somebody who has no formal training in poetry and in classical Chinese poetry. This is like really an elite practice that requires a lot of training. So this is looking at modern poetry, modern Chinese poetry in a very revolutionary way. And I use transposition to understand some of his bilingual poetry, which has just been written off as either not making sense or being too trendy. So you get a sense in this poem, this is translated to Chat with Verlaine. It's really interesting structurally. So you see basically this dialogue and the lines that are attributed to Verlaine, which are in French here, are taken from Verlaine's poem, Oh mon Dieu, vous m'avez blessé d'amour, which is not one of his famous poems, but it was published in a collection from 1881 titled Sagesse. And the many times I've seen this poem reprinted, it is with this typo that's missing from Sagesse. So it's this problem where you know, a lot of writers, especially poets, were incorporating lines of foreign literature, foreign poetry, but there was no way to kind of look out for typos and things like that. But it alternates lines taken from Verlaine's poem with then lines that Lee Jin Fat has composed in his Chinese. And I'll show you some of the criticism that he received, but it was very negative because he's writing in this way that is borrowing certain words or constructions from classical Chinese, but he was not trained. He didn't receive any proper academic training in literary Chinese Wenyan Wen. So yeah, it's very challenging to understand, and a lot of the negative criticism that he received was related to his lack of formal training in both French and in literary Chinese. So I talk about in this chapter that Lee's work really represents this liberating idea about artistic inspiration that you know, the artist can kind of borrow from these different sources of inspiration without any kind of training, but this is actually seen or interpreted as a very offensive idea to literary critics at the time. And then these are the engravings that I mentioned earlier, which accompanied Liang Zongdai's translations of Talcion's poetry. And so in my chapter on Changyu, Changyu was a painter that traveled to Paris as an art student in 1921, and he was trained in classical calligraphy as a youth in Paris, where he stayed actually until his death. So he's unlike the other figures I talk about in that he actually stayed in Paris for the rest of his life. He was referred to as the Chinese Matisse, and we can see that he's taken kind of three of the stories, or they're prose poems by Talcion, and he's highlighting very different aspects of these poems than what was originally kind of being conveyed in the poems. So I'll show you here, this is more of what Changyu is known for, which is his nude paintings. I think over 2,000 of these nude paintings still exist. So I'm interested in thinking about a way to understand kind of the connection between these engravings and these paintings. And I think that the concept of transposition is really helpful here, because we see these icons of classical Chinese literature or art that are being reflected. So in this painting here, and we see in a lot of his nude paintings, we have this nude model who's lying on a kind of Chinese fabric. And this is also an interesting kind of retake of chinoiserie, which is the 17th, 18th century style of European interpretation of exotic Asian inspired art. So we could see how the painting brings together these nature motifs from traditional style Chinese embroidery, but also kind of juxtaposing that with this extremely modern image of the nude female body. And then another person whose work I talk about through this lens of transposition is the author Xu Xu, who traveled to Paris in the fall of 1936. And he published a lot of best-selling novels. Some of his works were adapted into movie screenplays, but despite this early popularity, he hasn't really been written into national Chinese literary history. So in the 1930s and 40s, his work was harshly criticized for just being these escapist romances and having no political relevance, which is seen as potentially being destructive to society at that time. And Xu eventually went into self-exile in Hong Kong in 1950. So this could also perhaps explain why his role in Chinese national literary history hasn't really been recognized at this point. So in my chapter on Xu, I look at this fictional space of the Parnas Studio, which is really prominent in two of his, these are semi-fictional travel stories. They feature a first-person narrator protagonist who we can kind of compare to Xu himself. And one of the stories I look at is called Parnas Studio. And the story is about a love triangle between a Chinese male who is studying abroad with his female colleague, and they encounter this Dutch artist and his French female model. And we see the neighborhood of Montparnasse being described as this place having a long legacy, being associated with artists. It's a place where strangers become friends, and this is where they encounter this kind of bohemian artist and then his female model partner. And so I'm interested in this phrase, 情调, which is translated to kind of mood or sentiment. And the passage I have up here from that story is about how the narrator, even though he's not the Western kind of progressive artist, that he has this kind of artistic sensibility in being able to evaluate whether a work of art has aptly captured this kind of sentiment. And we see that word sentiment also in the title of the collection of stories, but it's also a concept that comes up in the second story I'm interested in, which is another love triangle story called The Duel. In both of these stories, the Chinese male protagonist, he wins over, all of the love interests in the stories and is seen as superior to his Western male counterparts because he has this kind of artistic expertise. And so this idea of the Oriental sentiment, actually in The Duel, it's very interesting because we have this protagonist who is on his sick bed, and he describes like a very similar situation to what that poet Lee Jin Fat wrote about in his memoir, where he's homesick, he's lying in bed, and he feels really ill, and then all of a sudden, he's inspired and then composes this classical Chinese style poem. And then when his French love interest comes to see him in this space, she discovers his poetry and is just overwhelmed with how amazing and beautiful it is. And so the lines I have up here come from this interaction where she's reading his poetry and saying, oh, I didn't realize you were a poet. Why didn't you ever tell me this, right? And he's saying the Chinese people are a poetic race. If we call them poets, then everyone in China would be considered a poet. So this, recalls what I was talking about earlier in terms of this literary kind of legacy. And what's really interesting in this story is that once she calls him a poet, she comes back and she actually dresses up to reflect what he wrote about in his poetry, which is these having these green jade earrings. And he tells her, no, you still you haven't captured that Oriental sentiment properly until you understand Chinese landscape painting. So then she studies the paintings that he has in his space there, and then automatically just falls in love with him, right? So it's related to that kind of artistic sensibility. So transposition for Xu Xu in these stories serves as a way for his narrator protagonists to achieve romantic and sexual victory. And this is always in the form of Chinese aesthetic expertise, which is being imagined as desirable and appreciated in Paris. Okay, so I will just finish up now with some concluding remarks on global literary prestige and also art diplomacy. In the last decade, this earlier period of cultural exchange has been commemorated by artistic institutions in China and France. The Musée Czerniewski in Paris held an exhibition in 2011 featuring the works of Chinese artists in Paris from 1920 to 1958, marking this as a formative period responsible for the artistic rupture from Chinese tradition. In 2014, the China Art Museum in Shanghai held an exhibit titled Shanghai, Paris, Modern Art of China to celebrate the influence of Shanghai-based artists that traveled to Paris from the 1920s through the beginning of the 21st century, affirming Shanghai's development as a portal of China for receiving and interacting with Western cultures. An introductory essay in the exhibition catalog by French curator Philippe Cinquini is titled Shanghai Asked, Paris Replied, aptly expressing how the exchange between these two symbolic cultural centers has been narrativized. More local context, just this year, the Royal BC Museum in Victoria is featuring a traveling exhibit about Emily Carr that feeds into the long legacy of Paris as a site of artistic and literary consecration. But as Cinquini concedes, when Paris responded to Shanghai's call in the early 20th century, the response was not exactly what we have imagined. The examples that I've talked about today challenge existing notions of Paris as the endless provider of creative inspiration. While Chinese artists and writers were certainly excited about opportunities to learn from their experiences in France, these intercultural exchanges did not guarantee critical or even popular success in China or France. In the acts of transposition highlighted here, Chinese writers and artists actively played with the global perception of Chinese identity by presenting and circulating cultural elements inspired by classical aesthetics in a new context, as a way to experiment with making Chinese culture more approachable, if not quite universal, then at the very least recognizable for French readers or audiences, at the same time negotiating expectations as a foreign artist abroad. They devised creative and strategic ways to enter a more global art community, and they also risked not receiving critical, political, or popular acclaim, or even approval in those contexts. In a record of my own inspiration, the poet Lee Jin Fat, whose poetry I briefly showed, he confessed, when writing poems, I never prepared myself to worry if people found them difficult. I simply sought to give vent to the poetic feeling in my heart of hearts. Now, indeed, there are many in the world whose heartstrings have struck a common chord with mine. My style has universal appeal. I just cannot be like others and use poetry to write about revolutionary thought or stir people to strike out or shed blood. My poetry is a record of my own inspiration. A song sung aloud in intoxication, I cannot hope that everyone will understand it. Sure enough, as he predicted, no one could really understand his poetry. And part of that problem is that most of his poems included foreign non-Chinese language texts. This literary trait could indicate, on the one hand, a cosmopolitan connectedness with world language and literature, the universal appeal Lee refers to, but on the other hand, it could easily frustrate readers who could not understand the content of those references. So just to give you a sense of some of the negative critiques he received in 1932, the critic Su Zheding warned, of Lee's poems, there is not a single one that we can expect to fully understand. The Crescent School poet Bian Zhiling wrote of Lee's poetry, the fact is that his far from adequate knowledge of French and his no less inadequate mastery of his mother tongue, both in Baihua vernacular and Wenyan literary language, did gross injustice to the French symbolists. And in 1981, the critic Sun Shizhen referred to Lee as the leading culprit of language demolishers, which is really harsh. As a result, Lee Jin Fat has been remembered by his nickname, the eccentric of poetry, 诗怪, and his work considered in Chinese literary history as an utter failure. Similarly, Changyu's career has been characterized by art historians as being misplaced and mistimed, according to his biographer, Rita Wong, who writes that his work, quote, did not have a lasting impact and could not be sustained. His art, interestingly, now sells for millions of dollars in auction houses, and museums in Taiwan have organized solo retrospective shows of his paintings in recent years, such as the exhibit of 49 oil paintings held at the National Museum of History in 2017, titled Parisian Nostalgia, the National Museum of History's Sanyu collection. But Eugene Wang calls his career a story of missed opportunities, blaming his lack of enterprise, his self-absorption and carefree hedonism, all traits associated with traditional literati, for not heeding the commercial demands of the art market. Reading his work through the lens of transposition and alongside literary production is one way to recuperate Changyu's contributions to the circulation of Chinese art abroad. This reading provides a more nuanced view of what being called mistimed and misplaced implies, and it can also uncover the layers of negotiation that a Chinese artist in Paris encountered as a cultural mediator, marketer, and translator, revealing the reasons why his work took so long to be rediscovered. So to return to the role of art diplomacy between China and the West, cultural exchanges are shaped by social, political, and economic conditions, but they also have the potential to shape those very conditions. In the early 20th century, this issue of cultural prestige was as urgent as it remains today. By paying attention to previously marginalized archives, we can better understand the artistic strategies employed by Chinese artists and writers in the early 20th century, and the reasons why Paris became the site for experimenting with the circulation of Chinese cultural identity. These reasons are more complicated than simply that its nurturing atmosphere fostered creative freedom not accessible in China, or that its artistic legacy was unshakable. Viewing literature and art through the lens of transposition uncovers what remained recognizable overseas and also what was transformed in this context, showing how cultural difference was circulated and promoted to challenge existing notions about modern Chinese art to a global audience. So I will end here, and I look forward to hearing your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Angie, for allowing us insight into your current research. And I understand a book manuscript that is pretty close to being finalized, or is this too optimistic?
Hopefully, yes, hopefully, hopefully close.
Yeah. You can see the applause here. Unfortunately, not really. So who would like to start us off with some questions? Anyone who wants to go first? If not, while maybe people still thinking about this, I was wondering, when listening, or Karen or Pablo, do you want to? Do you have a question right away?
I will ask a question. And just
sure.
Listening to kind of this sort of silenced histories of the Chinese artists being exposed. One of the things that came to my mind is that it's happening at a time of great Chinese influence and a kind of shift of empires, if you like. And I wonder if it's unfortunate that in order for the voices to really be heard, they have to be heard at a time when there's that transformation going, or transposition going on in the actual state, in the actual construction of China and the power it has in the world. Why I'm asking this is because I fear that we'll be able to rescue the Chinese voices of that period, but I wonder how many others are left behind. So I'm very grateful for the work you're doing, but I'm wondering about all the other silenced voices of that period.
Yeah, I appreciate that sort of concern as well, because I think I mentioned this term of Sinophone literature and Sinophone kind of cultural production. So there is also the sense of the kinds of colonialist like projects that China as a nation is carrying out, also, you know, in that period, but also in the present period as well. So I was kind of struggling with this idea of beyond Shanghai and beyond Paris, because I think both of these places are associated with having a kind of, you know, like overwhelming kind of dominance in these kinds of cultural relations. So I'm curious about your comment. Like, do you mean in the present moment, or are you talking about in this earlier period of 20th century?
Well, I actually, you just made me realize about the earlier period happening also. I was thinking more about this period, and you know, for example, at the exhibitions going on, and you know how Chinese artists are being mentioned and all this, and I wonder in my head how much of it is because of funding going into these organizations coming from China, because it's also something I'm observing in Spain right now with everything, not just art, right? It's just the deep Chinese financial impact, which I think it's you know, we've been all warned about it. I'm glad it's happening in a way, but I worry about, you know, I think it results. I love that the Chinese artists now are being heard, and that, you know, and that we're realizing their genealogies and their influence in even Western conceptions of art. But I'm concerned about how those silent voices are going to be able to come out. For example, if we wanted to do it from below and without being an empire, right? How do we do it? So does that, sorry.
Yes. Yeah, no, I had this section that I took out at the end because it was getting too long, but I think that the added factor of the funding, which was not so such a big deal in the period that I was talking about, it adds this extra layer of complexity. So I think it's good to be skeptical and aware of that. So actually in the last section, I wanted to talk about kind of global prestige right now in the present day, and how for, we can't really separate that from the kind of financial aspect. So for, you know, writers and artists who are working in the 21st century, you know, it's very difficult because they want to have that kind of accessibility and have their work be circulated on this global level. But you know, so many of the institutions that are seen as maybe neutral, right, and they can provide some sort of artistic prestige or cultural prestige on this global scale, they're not actually neutral, right, because they are receiving funding from these different government sources. So I think that that's really important to keep in mind. Also, I think in this earlier period, it's, I don't know if it's like simpler, but you know, there's less prestige, but it also seems like, I don't want to say pure art, but there's something a little bit like less complicated happening there, maybe. Yeah, thank you for that.
Well, thank you for the amazing work that you're doing. Thank you.
Sorry, thanks both of you. I have seen that 3 people have turned on their screens. I take it as an indication that you would like to have a question. So maybe if you start with Nicole, Malea, and then Rod. Nicole, if you're not frozen.
I was just turning on my screen to be a good citizen, but
okay,
I do have a question. Angie, thanks for your talk. That was fantastic. I'm kind of curious about this idea of transposition, and I'm thinking about it in terms of this actually happening all of the time. With, I mean, I don't know anything about art. I don't study art, but this idea that I guess the question would be, compared to their contemporaries who stayed in China, do you see a real distinct difference between artists who went to Paris and what they were doing, and what is happening from those who stayed in Shanghai. And then the other ways in which those who stay in Shanghai also, their work also has transposition in it, but it's not of a French culture of the Parisian artists scene.
Maybe, Angie, for a second, maybe I can just add to Nicole, because my question was very much along those lines. You know, you spoke about a deep break with Chinese artist tradition, of that those experience being in Paris, right? Yeah, so that speaks to the same thing. You know, what was the impact, and how did it reflect back, comparing what was happening in China and then we want to call it diaspora in Paris?
Well, yeah, thank you both for that question. And I think this is something that Casanova has talked about too, about the prestige of Paris, which is, you know, part of it was that people actually physically went there and studied there. But supposedly, like, the appeal or the draw of it was so powerful that even for people who didn't go there, right, the people that went there and came back and they wrote about it, other people who couldn't travel there, they read that literature and they produced literature that was inspired by those experiences. So I think there are definitely a lot of fiction writers and poets who didn't physically travel to Paris during that time, but they, you know, based on accounts that they had read in translation or based on Chinese accounts of being abroad, they were able to write kind of imagined or fictionalized versions of what it would be like to go there, right? Or the experiences of people who had gone there. So I think that that's one way to think about the impact of that. But I would also say that for the people who did go there, the people that I focus on, at least in my project, I think one distinction is really in terms of like an emphasis on that kind of expression of difference. So that writer I talked about, Xu, who was talking about this Oriental sentiment. And I've been trying to figure out what the origins of this Chinese word qingdiao is. So if anybody has any thoughts, I'd be curious. But diao is actually like refers to a kind of musical element, also like a tone or a melody. And qing means, it means a lot of things, but it could mean kind of romantic love. But it refers to, like, during this period, it's usually in response to a kind of foreign sentiment or Oriental or Western sentiment. So in his writing, that passage that I showed was really about like ways of expressing this sentiment. And I think sentiment already is a very abstract kind of concept, right? So I think there's like heightened awareness on how to like best convey these cultural differences that I don't see as much in, say, like fictionalized accounts, right? And I think it has to do maybe with the lived experience of Nicole, like what we were talking about yesterday in terms of displacement, right? Maybe just these cross-cultural moments of encounter that really, I think, emphasize like the need to have some sort of way of expressing something that might not be so easily like translatable or translated. Yeah.
Thank you. Malia, do you have a question?
Maybe this is because we're all three political sciencey types. I had a question that was very similar to Nicole and Oliver, so Angie has already answered it. I'll just add in, that was a really fascinating talk. I love going to talks that are so far outside my area of work, and this was one of them, so thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I was scared it didn't fit in with anything, so I
it's terrific that it didn't fit with what we have often heard. It's great.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Definitely no concern about a good fit here. Rod.
Well, in fact, I was going to say thank you very much indeed. It was fascinating, and it seems to me it's the core question in public policy and public administration. You are hitting right at the central problem. Aviva Hosek once told me that you can translate everything about a poem except the poem. And that question, it seems to me that you're, in a sense, loosening the test. You know, if we ask who should get the Nobel Prize for literature for a Polish work in translation in English, it really raises questions of who's captured the intent of the writer. And so you got this question of what's lost in the translation. And now you've introduced a further transposition. In translation, we could at least ask, does the translator capture what the words seem to be saying? But now we've lost that test. You're really asking us, does this downstream work capture the intent, even if it departs dramatically from the language? So I'm going back to this question of how do the text arrived at through social processes of deliberative democracy, we arrive at a text at national or global level, and then we want to see action at the street level, which somehow realizes the intent of that text. But you've created a difficult problem for us because we can only transpose the text onto the street. How do we know whether it's captured the intent? I mean, we don't know it in the work of Mozart. Even less do we know it in the sort of the legislation.
Angie,
I'm
over
not
to
sure how you respond to that question, but it does seem to me that you posed a really, really fascinating problem for public administration.
Yeah, thank you for that. I hope I haven't made things more confusing, but I think what I'm trying to suggest is that I think that this is like why some of these works have been marginalized, is that because they really kind of frustrate like these categories of identifying literature, right? Like we want to categorize literature by these national boundaries. And for somebody like Chang, he's often seen as somebody, they call him like neither nor, right? He doesn't fit into like French or Chinese. His work, at least, doesn't fit into that. And his life like was also very interesting. Like he tried to promote this sport. He invented a sport called ping tennis. It was like ping pong, but it was tennis, but like reduced to ping pong size, you know? And I think it sounds hilarious, but I think it's also like that concept of transposition, right? Like taking something and like putting it in this context. But, you know, unfortunately, some of these things just aren't very successful, you know, in a critical level or a popular level or a financial level. So I think it does make this idea of transposition does make things like a little bit more difficult to categorize. And in terms of like how it's received, how do we know like whether something is successful or not? I think looking at that critical reception is only half of it, right? And I think it is difficult to evaluate, especially like historically, because not for art especially, there aren't that many documents that are left. So some of the archives that I'm looking at are, you know, kind of like newspaper articles or interviews that Chang gave. And again, like those wouldn't fit so much like into the art archive. But what I'm trying to do is really look at visual art and literature like together alongside one another. And I hope that's one thing that's come across, at least in my work. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to Ted, who is now properly themed in terms of the Zoom background.
Thanks, Oliver. You challenged me to see what I could find. Angie, thank you so much. I loved towards the end there, you used the term cross-cultural moments of encounter. To me, really poignant. I think it's a good part of your presentation today, and thanks for that. Didn't necessarily have a question, but I've considered one here, and it's the flip side, if you will, of those artisans around the world, be it Paris or Florence or in India, Saudi Arabia, that have a rich history themselves, and their visitations to China and kind of what they brought back to their respective cultures over the years, be it early 1900s or modern day, or Marco Polo's time, etc. We had the pleasure of I think it was about a 3-week tour of in and around China, starting in Shanghai, finishing off in Beijing, and I think that was about a year after the Beijing Olympics, where it was an opportunity for China to kind of show themselves to the world and all its modern glory and very quite extraordinary in and of itself, that event. But the proverbial Great Wall and the terracotta warriors and the silk factories and the ceramic factories and the Chinese theater, etc. So such a deep, rich history. And I'm just curious if you have a story or two, or could think of an artisan that has come to China and brought back, translated, if you will, some of that rich history and culture to their, back to Paris, back to Florence, or what have you.
Yeah. Thank you, Ted. I think there are actually a lot of French writers that wrote about this, like André Malraux, for instance. Like, he went to Shanghai and wrote a lot of fiction that was inspired by that. So I think there is a kind of long-standing practice of that. And I'm curious actually about what you mentioned about this tour, because one of the things that I've struggled with is that there is like a continuous, like very consistent effort to promote this earlier period of Chinese art. I'm curious, like on your tour, did they show anything about things like more contemporary kind of art, or was it just all focused on kind of classical, pre-modern?
That's a good question. Beyond my reference to Beijing, to the Olympics, and they, we just basically skirted the outsides of the buildings at that point. I'd have to say, and kind of in a nutshell, it was more about, very much about the rich history and the magnitude of the buildings and the structures, like the Forbidden City and the Winter Palace and the Great Wall, etc. We did visit Chinese gardens and a Chinese theater, and a lot of that again. The gardens are obviously fairly modern day, plants and flowers there, etc. But largely the history. I'd have to say largely the history, apart from just the natural landscape, the beauty of the natural landscape and the diversity of it. I guess one of the modern things, and it doesn't really answer your question, is the Three Gorges Dam and the week or so that we spent going up there, of course, which has displaced millions of Chinese, and the architecture that they tried to scramble to retrieve in the valley bottoms before the flooding. But in short answer, I'd have to say largely focused on world-renowned sites and largely the rich history of China.
Okay, yeah, that sounds about right. But I think a lot of those old buildings have probably been restored numerous times anyway, so it is new in some sense. Yeah.
Right.
We're getting close to the end. As I told you, I would love to have 10 minutes at the end. Any other question? I feel inclined, although I'm not sure we have time for this, to ask Angie how the perception of those artists, their legacy, or what they did in Paris, might have changed under communist China? Was there kind of a re-evaluation of what they, what they achieved, or what it meant for Chinese artists to be in Paris, right? Was there kind of a revisionist way of either appropriating or rejecting these artists? Maybe you could briefly address this unless there's any other question, and then we can move to the discussion of the 5-year review.
Yeah, I mean, definitely during the socialist period, all of this writing was banned, which is also partially why they have been marginalized. And what I mentioned, Chang's work is some of it got shipped out to Taiwan because of that. So yes, I mean, not just reevaluated, but really forgotten during that period, banned, and then only rediscovered after the Cultural Revolution in the 1980s. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Angie. Probably you've, from what you've probably, it's hard to feel the room, but I hope you realized, how fascinated your research has been, even for those people who are very much outside your field, and how it speaks very much, Rod, I'm still, thinking about how it speaks to public policy challenges, but I'm coming around, to seeing this. But in general, I think, clearly the cultural exchange across borders, right? How, issues of prestige, of identity, that speaks very much to the core of what we do at the center. So absolutely no issue here. And the best of luck, it should be a fabulous book that you're producing.